Welcome to the Hero Maker podcast. I'm Andrea Schreeman, writer, director, EP, living in LA.
I'm Jennifer Morrison, and I currently serve as the Commissioner of Public Safety for the state of Vermont.
We are here to seek out and tell the full story of our friends who were murdered in college, Rachel Raver and Warren Fulton III.
We really need to make sure that their deaths were not in vain and that every possible lesson and improvement for the system can be squeezed from the retelling of the circumstances that ultimately led to the identification of their killer.
Welcome back to the Hero Maker podcast. I'm so excited to introduce Renee Williams to our listeners. She is the executive director of the National Center for Victims of Crime. And we had a great conversation with her, didn't we, Jen?
We did have an excellent conversation with Renee. She was a wealth of knowledge, and our conversation went in so many directions, but each one more fertile and interesting than the one before. And that conversation could have gone on for hours.
Yes. Well, I know that you've always been really passionate about victim services. Before we kind of jump into this, is there anything you want to say about your experience? What brought you to the place to be so passionate about it?
Well, I would like to think that I'm a naturally compassionate person, but in my career in policing, my empathy and desire to really see crime victims get somewhat equal treatment to all the investment we make in offenders really started when I was serving in the sex crimes and child abuse unit, because you see the depth of damage that happens in those cases, the inability to trust, the broken families that result from some of these cases. And I really, really started to focus on how can we better provide wraparound services to these crime victims in these most heinous cases. And then later in my career, when I was a patrol lieutenant, I was tasked with being the program director. We had three directors, one at the Burlington Community Justice Center and one at the Vermont Center for Crime Victim Services. And then I was the lead at the Burlington Police Department. And the three organizations, we created one of the country's first pilot projects in parallel justice. And it was considered a new way to look at crime victims. In the traditional victim service world, only crime victims who report to the police and for whom certain criteria can be met, they are allowed to receive services provided by the state. But the concept of parallel justice is that all victims matter and all victims need to be supported and raised up by their community. So it did not require that you talk to a police officer and make a police report, although plenty of those crime victims were served. And it didn't require that your perpetrator be identified or caught. So parallel justice for victims of crime became a bit of a really important project, not just administratively to pilot a nationwide project, but to replicate it. We built a replication handbook and try and infuse these concepts throughout the many other sort of cutting edge alternatives to traditional crime fighting that we used in the city of Burlington. I mean, we were early adopters of diversion, of alternative justice, reparative boards, and now, of course, parallel justice. So I was happy that she knew about it, gave me some common touch points with her.
Yeah, for sure. And anything I think that we can infuse into our society to heal people. It sounds like you've done a lot of work on bringing more people into that fold of healing. And we'll hear a lot more about parallel justice and about how to get services. I really think this is a great episode for anyone who has ever been victimized, even if they didn't report it, because there's a lot of information in here. And then, of course, even if you're a family member of someone who went through a violent crime or death, I think there's information for you here too. And it's just great edification for anyone who wants to understand a little bit more about the landscape of what can happen and the extent of how these services reach and the necessity for them. Okay, so I have some good news.
I can't wait.
The Hero Maker podcast has a fiscal sponsor.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Tell me more.
Okay. It's called the Williamson County Cultural Arts Commission
Okay.
out of Franklin, Tennessee. And WCCAC has now taken us on as one of their projects, and people can actually write tax deductible donations to benefit this podcast so that we can keep telling the story. WCCAC created a little ad for our podcast so people can listen to the ad and hear what they do. And actually, the guy who's his voice on the ad is a musician by the name of Sweepy Walker.
Sweepy Walker.
Yeah. Yeah, he's got a beautiful voice. Yeah.
Sweepy Walker. Take it away.
The Williamson County Cultural Arts Commission of Franklin, Tennessee wishes to thank our men and women in blue who help us deliver safe and fun family and community cultural events year-round, including one of the only authentic bluegrass festivals in the country. Bluegrass Along the Harpeth takes place every July and at the Williamson County Fair in August and at the annual Tennessee International Independent Film Festival. Check out our full calendar of events at wccac-tn.org.
The only other thing that we need to let people know is that they can support the podcast with a tax-deductible donation by going to our website, which is thehero-maker-podcast.com.
Why would they have an interest in a podcast like ours? I'm just a little curious.
Well, they have a great relationship with their law enforcement in the area. So they can't run their events without their men and women in blue. And they also support important stories. And they really took a liking to our story and thought that what we were doing was really important.
Big shout out to the Williamson County Cultural Arts Commission, found in Tennessee, just right outside of Nashville.
Yeah, Franklin, Tennessee. I visited Franklin about a month ago, and it's just really special. Beautiful, bucolic, but also with this like kind of older city center that's got all this beautiful older architecture. And I found a bacon donut there. Have you ever had a bacon donut?
We have maple bacon donuts. We have bacon donuts. We have, yeah, I've had bacon donut.
This was like a bacon cream donut. I did not eat it. All I did was like photograph it like it was some kind of artifact.
You didn't eat it? It involved bacon and you didn't eat it? Recently, somebody asked me what one food was that I couldn't live without. And I was like, bacon, crispy bacon. Chocolate is second place, but crispy bacon.
Have you ever had chocolate covered bacon?
Oh, yeah, totally. I've had chocolate covered bacon drizzled with caramel. I've had black pepper bacon in white chocolate. I've had it all. Bacon every way there is.
Well, unfortunately, we're not sponsored by bacon.
Okay.
But we could be. We could be.
Bacon boys.
Someone at the
bacon boys.
The National Bacon Association could hear this.
The Bacon Commission needs to get right up here.
But I wanted to share the good news.
Oh, I'm so excited. That's great.
We actually got our first check already.
Oh, yeah?
Our friend Kate sent us $500.
Oh, Kate is great. That's always what I said about her. Kate is great.
Kate is great. Hashtag Kate is great. Welcome back. Today on the podcast, we are super blessed to have Renee Williams, who is the executive director of the National Center for Victims of Crime. And I mean, I have tons of questions, and I'm hoping you're bringing lots of data because I really want to get into what's going on in this arena and how people are really being served and what are the new ways that we're finding to kind of heal trauma in our country, because I think it's just layer upon layer upon layer of trauma that we're dealing with. And I just am so curious from hopefully an expert to hear where we are. And then also to hear you and Jen talk a little bit, because y'all are out there helping people and dealing with people who are victims and survivors. And I just would love to hear y'all geek out a little bit.
That's never a problem with me geeking out.
Right on.
So what is it, just quickly basics, what you do and what the organization does?
Sure. So I'm the executive director, again, of the National Center for Victims of Crime. And we started, interestingly, from one of America's first kind of true crime obsessions, which was the Sonny Von Bulow case. She was put into a coma by her husband, Klaus von Bülow, who was a fake dignitary.
Count or something?
He was a fake count, yeah. And
Yeah.
Sunny actually was a princess. Well, her children were princesses, but she was a very wealthy heiress. And she was put into a coma by Klaus. And while they were prosecuting the case, her children were just so appalled by the way they were treated throughout the prosecution as victims, and realizing that they had money. And so if they had money and they were being treated like this, how were other victims being treated? So they put all of their inheritance towards founding our center so that victims would not go through that again. So we really started as an advocacy group before Marcy's laws were passed, before there were victims' bills of rights. We were the ones that were pushing that forward. We've shifted a little bit into, I like to say that we help victims at every single point of victimization. So we have a hotline that serves victims nationally. From the second they experience a crime, they can call. We will find them services. We also provide training and technical assistance to any victim service providers, and that includes judges and prosecutors. Sometimes they don't think they need it, but they do. And we also make sure that we help in the civil justice system if a case goes to civil justice.
What year were you guys founded?
85.
Yeah, that's right around, that's really contemporaneous to when our friends were murdered. And I can tell you in my career, which started in 1990, just over the course of my career, the field of victim services grew from its infancy to some really incredible stuff that's happening now. And it is like night and day between how it was when I was a rookie cop to how it was when I retired as a police chief.
Yeah, it really has. And it's interesting because I think before, even finding victim services was rare. And now we have organizations that are dedicated to very small types of crime. So it's become very interesting.
Well, I know this is a dirt road that we can't go down too far today, but I was very proud. One of my proudest moments in law enforcement was as one of the founding members of the Parallel Justice for Victims of Crime in Burlington, Vermont. We were one of the 3 national pilot sites, and we are still up and running today. So we were on the ground floor of Susan Herman's work around parallel justice, and it was a really impactful time in my career to be part of that group.
You're right. There are so many dirt roads we could go down there. I don't think Andrea wants us to today.
Not today, but maybe another time.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just define parallel justice, at least that?
Oh, it's a totally different way of looking at crime victims. Like, it's based on an African tribal practice. I'm probably going to get this wrong because it's been a number of years, but where instead of engaging in victim blaming or victim shaming or shunning, victims of crime or injustice were placed on a chair and hoisted up in the air and carried around the village where people would affirm the victim and express inclusion and warmth to bring that person as quickly back into the fold, because being the victim of a crime can be incredibly alienating, and people either perceive they're ostracized or they are ostracized. And it really others people when they are the victim, particularly of a very personal crime like a sex crime or a domestic violence crime. And so the concept of parallel justice was to restore a crime victim to as full a place as they were before, and even more so, and surround them with supports, fill gaps that the traditional justice system cannot fill, like providing transportation to a doctor's appointment or a therapy appointment or to a court hearing, and meeting the victim where they are and what their needs are to get them back into 100% functioning.
And that's to address the fact that oftentimes the criminal justice system leaves victims unsatisfied or wanting more because of how the criminal justice system is set up, which is to protect the rights of defendants, which is correct constitutionally, but it often does leave victims out of the loop completely and can be re-traumatizing.
Over and over again, re-traumatizing. And parallel justice also is not at all offender focused. Like, it's a totally separate track. I'm sure you have the stats, but it's something like for every dollar that we put into the system for an offender or a program around an offender or representation of offenders, we put like 6 cents in for victims or something like that. It's some infinitesimally small amount of the justice system that supports crime victims. So parallel justice for victims of crime is intended to be a completely different way of supporting crime victims in addition to however the justice system can support them. Because remember, a lot of crimes don't get reported to the police, so there is no support through the justice system. And parallel justice will help those people too. A lot of crimes do get reported, but an offender is never identified or enough of a case made to charge them. Those people can get help through parallel justice. Whereas the current construct in the justice system is that only survivors and family members of people who are actually charged, that's a pretty high bar, get support through the formal system. So PJ is like a big, much bigger catchment area for survivors of crime, like people who are undocumented, who don't want to have an interface with law enforcement, have a place to go and get support without reporting their crime to police and going through the whole process.
And frankly, oftentimes it is only, as Jen said, the perpetrator who is actually convicted. Can crime victims get support? But if there were enablers, and I'm thinking the Catholic Church, there are non-individual perpetrators, really, who allowed crimes to continue to happen, but who the criminal justice system does not hold accountable. It addresses that as well.
Well, that's interesting. And then is parallel justice a thing?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, is it actually happening in our country? And did it spread out from those pilot programs? And how much of it is a part of the work that you do, Renee?
It's really morphed. It even morphed into, we start to look at civil litigation, and I work with a lot of plaintiffs' attorneys, and some people don't like them, but we have a lot of plaintiffs' attorneys who have gotten involved to help these crime victims receive some measure of help to get them moving back in the right direction. So it has taken off, but it's morphed as well into several different iterations.
But the resonance of it exists out there in some resources that I'm sure that's not everywhere, but
no, it's not everywhere. But
it's not. No,
Redlands, California, they were really far ahead of us. They were doing incredible work in this area. Winston-Salem, North Carolina, I believe, still has a parallel justice program. It's a bit of a dirt road, but it illustrates how far the world of crime victim services has come since Rachel and Warren were murdered. And the fact that Dede was connected at all to victim service groups, those were groups that were in their infancy. And today they are far more robust, better funded, and we have a lot more data on what victimization means for people and how to address it.
So Renee, I mean, there's so many different ways that we can go with this, but would you share just like maybe some success stories, like things that are really working in the space and working for your organization and results that you're seeing?
Sure. So I will say our hotline is a huge success. It's the connection and it's knowing where to go when you have this crime committed. And still a lot of people don't. You know, we have victims' bills of rights from state to state, but they're really only as good as the jurisdiction where the crime is committed because some folks don't even know about them. So our hotlines have done extremely well because people can just call and we will help them nationwide. We also have an online resource for tribal members called the Tribal Resource Tool, where we are connecting people to culturally specific programs. I think one of the bigger things we're seeing right now, one of the bigger hiccups, is that a lot of victim services are still geared towards what we would call mainstream victims, which frankly would be your white female sex abuse victim or domestic violence abuse victim. And so what we are looking at doing, which I think will be hugely successful, is actually creating communities of care within communities that aren't your mainstream communities so that they can be receiving the same services. Because I described it to my staff as, look, you can say you have all the services in the world, and that's great. And you can also say that they're meant for everybody, and you mean for them to be trauma-informed, and that's great. But imagine you're standing on one side of a canyon, and you are looking on the other side of a canyon, and you see that it's the land of milk and honey over there, and it's beautiful, and they have all the resources. But you can't get over there because the only thing that's going to get you there is a rickety old bridge. Are you going to trust that rickety bridge to get over?
Yeah, and that's a lot of what we've seen, the growth of victim services is building more on-ramps, raising awareness of what victimization means, but also what are the available community resources and putting more on-ramps in, healthcare providers, schools, so that people can point victims onto those on-ramps and get connected to services?
I would just want to look at this word really quickly, victim, because I think we're using it simultaneously to mean a lot of different things. We say survivor also, right? So like a family member of someone who was murdered, that's a victim or a survivor, right? Someone who, I mean, I heard you say something like this, Renee, that like many times the people who are impacted by trauma aren't always like the husband, the wife, the mother, the sister. Sometimes it's like, 3 steps removed, the friend. And that trauma has a way of seeping out into all these directions that you're just not sure who's going to feel the greatest impact. So I guess I'm looking at who qualifies for these services. And do you find that people are afraid to even say, I'm a victim or I need a service? And is the first level of this anonymous so that if people are feeling a sense of trepidation and fear, that they can just, no one's looking, they're just going to call the number and see what's on the other end?
So, Andrea, that is a loaded question because there's a lot of debate about it in the victim service field. So some folks want to be called victims. Some want to be called survivors. We use the term victim in our everyday work and in all of our materials because in a lot of states, certain rights attach to the word victim. They don't attach to the right of survivors. And only victims are recognized, which is why we have chosen to stick with the term victims, even though we use it interchangeably when not being official. Each state will define what a victim of crime is or what a crime is. We try to not define that on our hotline, but help anybody who calls us get services. But it's really state by state how legally a victim is defined. Now, morally and ethically, I think a victim is anybody who's been traumatized. And they deserve to get help and they deserve to be looked at without judgment. It's just legally only certain rights attached to certain victims.
Yeah. Jennifer, do you have anything to say about that?
Oh, I have a lot, but there's a lot of dirt roads here. So I think we should keep going in the direction you want to go. Don't worry, I won't be shy.
Yeah. So this is really interesting though. The first thing I think of is I would love for you to go in terms of services. If you live in this state, you're screwed. If you live in this state, hey, if you want to be a victim, you should be a victim in New York because you're going to be well taken care. I mean, I don't know.
Well, and here's the funny thing. First of all, it's crime by crime. So some states are really tough on certain types of crime and other states are better for certain types of crime. It really depends on that. But what it also really depends on, it comes down, unfortunately, to individuals. And so in certain jurisdictions, you have outstanding victim advocates who are on top of it and they know what they're doing. And in other jurisdictions, they're not quite as sure. So most states have some pretty basic protections in place for victims of crime. It really just boils down to how much your victim advocate knows and if you're connected with that victim advocate.
Right. So let's talk about that connection piece. I mean, in my experience, the tide has changed over the years from if you were one of the few victims who found out about a victim's advocate, you were lucky. What is your assessment of how we're doing today, right now, in terms of proactively contacting victims after their case is reported to the police? Or is it still incumbent on the victim to do the outreach and to get connected to services?
We're doing much better. There's a lot of proactive outreach. But unfortunately, I would say when speaking to victims, I encourage them to reach out just to be sure. And to stay on it just to be sure.
And when we think about those on-ramps, I know that, we're talking about a discipline, shall we say, that is less than 50 years old. Victim advocacy is still a relatively new profession, shall we say. How do you feel we are doing as a country? Or perhaps you could answer the way Andrea was looking at, which is, are there different states or regions that are doing it better than others? How do you feel we're doing on reaching underserved populations, whether that's by socioeconomic status or people who have housing insecurity or communities of color or non-English speakers?
Oh, we're atrocious at it. We're not doing any better. Some of that is because of the hesitancy to report. So specifically in communities of color, in immigrant communities, they're not going to get services because there's a fear of reporting for any number of historical reasons. And even when they do, Again, this goes back to they're forced to bend to a very specific type of victimization. They are forced, while in their trauma, to follow rules that were set out for people who are English speakers, who do have an easy time in the system. They aren't helped in any extra special way.
So we still have a lot of room for growth.
We do. And I think, frankly, the idea of being tough on crime or not being tough on crime, that has to be removed from our lexicon, because that doesn't help victims at all. There's a concept of you can be tough on crime. You don't have to say it, because tough on crime doesn't serve victims. It once again refocuses everything on defendants and on those who commit those crimes.
When you think about a crime similar to the one that brought me and Andy together, I mean, we were already together as you know,
College buddies.
College buddies and athletes at GW. We were in the same friend group, but there's something about tragedy that really can bring groups closer together. And so here we are 35 years later.
You know what? Let's just take a moment to add to what you're saying. We were giving no services. We were in our early 20s. Not only were we not given any services, I mean, one of our teammates said it better than anyone else. They just patted you on the back and said, I know, honey, this is hard, but go take your finals. And we were right at finals time.
Yep.
There were no conversations. There were, it was handled. I think if it had happened today like that, people would be very, very shocked. I'm not sure we knew enough to ask for help at that time. And I just want to kind of add that to the conversation.
Well, right. So we weren't offered any help. And I think I tried to explain this to you once, Andy, when you asked, how I felt. And Kate and I've not talked to Kate about this, but Kate and I were the captains of the team. And it fell to us to try and figure out how to help start the healing with our soccer players. And I have no idea if you had any help in your athletic team around that, but Kate and I felt very responsible. I know I felt very responsible for these very broken and now scared underclassmen in the wake of this experience. And even for the freshmen who hadn't played with Rachel, they were terrified when this news broke, and not even having anyone to turn to say, so how do we bring the team together? How do we comfort them? How do we whatever? We were totally left to figure this out on our own. And I think we did okay, but it was by the grace of God, not because we had any assistance. I agree that this would be handled totally differently now in today's world with the knowledge that we have and the resources that tend to exist.
And the awareness. I feel like universities have had a comeuppance, in the last, there were still sororities on campus and fraternities back when we were there, and they're not even on campus now. So I think a whole wave of awareness and responsibility and accountability has come to the college, university kind of community, where I think they would already have something in place for like grief or support or counseling or something, which I don't think they didn't have the awareness back then.
Yeah, it was interesting that you just said that whole thing about finals. I'd forgotten that piece, that it was the week before finals, I think. I think our finals were the end of that week and then the next week. And it was interesting because the university went to great lengths to make sure that the men's basketball team got their exams, that they were able to take them on the road, because they had to play their games. So they had the academic advisors that went along with the team and administered exams on the road, or got them a delay on their exams so that they could go play basketball.
I never knew they got their exams administered on the road.
Oh yeah.
So, but where were we going with this, Jen? You were originally wanted to say, here we were at this time in school, something
Right.
about not knowing where to go or not having someone come to us or.
Right. I had no awareness, and obviously nobody at the university did, about connecting us to a victim service.
I think most universities, so Title IX just started being used in the past 2 decades, I'd say, to address abuse on campus.
Campus violence.
Yeah, campus violence. Whereas before it was looked at as a way for women to play sports. It has been starting to use for campus violence. And so a lot of universities have started implementing some of the very things that you're talking about. An office, if you feel like you've been harassed, there are grief offices. They've also upped campus security a great deal.
Sure. When you think about a crime like what happened to Rachel and Warren, I'm sure that you are still serving families and other loved ones of victims of sexual assault and homicide. What do you think are the most important messages to share with those people who come to you in the first, let's say you only had an hour with those victims? What do you need to tell them?
My first honest advice would be careful who you talk to in the media, which is ironic given that we're doing a podcast right now. But with the proliferation of social media and this true crime obsession, what I've seen with families of murder victims, especially if there's something that's left open, is there will be a proliferation of what they said, and we will take it and run with it in this world. And so I'd say be very careful who you talk to in the media and work with your victim advocate. But any leads that you can follow, let people know, keep the police in the loop, but don't get frustrated at the same time. Even if you don't think you need treatment in that moment. And I will tell you, I had a young rape victim come to me when I was very early in my career, and she kept insisting that she did not need therapy. She didn't need it. She didn't need it. She didn't need it. And I think in that moment, you might think you don't, and you might think you're fine, but you should always at least be open to getting treatment and find someone to help you, because you have no idea how that's going to impact you 2 weeks later, 5 weeks later. We're just starting to realize and to recognize that PTSD applies to crime victims as well. And it applies to more than just the military. I think for a long time, it was just in our head as the military. And so that really impacts crime victims and crime victims' families, because it changes the neurobiology of your brain. And so, especially for crime victims, and regardless of what you think of who was right or wrong in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, a lot of the media's response was based on not understanding what PTSD is and how PTSD can change how you think, how you feel, how you process, how you remember things. And so it's very easy for us as the public to sit back and say, well, I'd never do that. But you don't know if you would or not, because you don't know how your brain will start to react and process down the line.
Do you think we're doing a better job today than we were 25 years ago at victim blaming?
I think the pendulum keeps swinging both ways. So I think we were doing better. I think Me Too helped a great deal. And I think we've shown an interest in wanting to do better. But I think a lot of times you kick back into that instinct of, I don't think sometimes our brains can handle the idea that people would be so horrible to each other as to do some of the things we do. And so we desperately psychologically seek out a reason somebody would do it. And sometimes that falls in our minds to the victim. So I think we're trying, but I don't know that we're there.
You were talking about the proliferation of the words of the survivors being played over and over, possibly being manipulated by social media or media. I'm assuming there's a huge negative impact to that. And I'm assuming that it falls in a couple areas. One I'm thinking is like, if the public gets to know your case really well, and you've already been shaped by the media as a particular, or the case has been shaped, then that might actually be troublesome when it goes to court. There's that. But then I'm also thinking like, you can't get a fair shake or something because people have made up their minds about you, even in the court of public opinion. So what are the kind of the things that can go wrong when you're out there talking about your case and people are manipulating your words or using them over and over? Or also the trauma gets replayed and replayed and replayed and replayed. So it's not only hurting you, but then it's hurting the community. And maybe this is an opportunity also, Jen, for you to chime in about how these events are not only about the individual survivors, but it also becomes like the whole community is trying to survive.
I think there's the very human perspective of harm, which is I have seen the sisters of murdered girls have people just attack them with questions and ask them deeply personal questions that you would not ask anybody else ever. And it's done under the guise of, well, they chose to be a public figure. Their sister was murdered and they did an interview or they did something to further the case and they are now a public figure. There are podcasters who will attack these family members, and then they start to come up with theories of the case based on nothing, based on absolutely no evidence. They're armchair sleuths. And they will start to say, you know, I think that there was clearly sexual abuse here based on this interview I saw. So not only are they attacking and hurting the families and forcing more trauma onto the families than was already there, but they are also then starting to circulate false theories on the cases that can throw investigations off.
Yeah, incivility is one of the biggest problems that I see in terms of our lack of community cohesion. And it's a whole nother trend that we could talk about, the social fabric of communities and what keeps a community safe. But let me talk a little bit about what my experience has been and see how you react, because I suspect you'll have some cogent input here. But when a crime happens, it's like a rock being thrown into a still pond, and you get a big splash right at the epicenter, which is the person upon whom the crime was perpetrated and perhaps immediate family members or roommates or whatever it is. And you have the ripples that go out in the wake of this, and they get smaller and smaller. They get bigger, but you know what I mean, smaller in impact. But just as those ripples touch a bigger area of the previously still pond, it's touching more people in the community in a different, perhaps not as violent way. But it's been my experience that a single incident, a gruesome murder or a sexual assault and murder, can not just have a deep, deep impact on many layers of that circle, but can impact an entire community. And by community, I don't necessarily mean a neighborhood. It could be an entire city, an entire portion of a state, an entire region. And I wonder what your experience is with that.
I agree with that. And I think it's not even geographic communities necessarily, but community types. So the LGBTQ community, ethnic communities. It doesn't matter where you live. If something happens that is traumatic, the nightclub shootings, the LGBTQ nightclub shootings, the whole community felt that very deeply, and it didn't matter where you lived. And that's one thing I think we have to learn and start to accept. And I do think we're getting there, is that you don't have to judge, and nobody else can judge your trauma. So if you feel traumatized by something, and I think we're seeing that especially with all of the mass shootings recently, it's okay to feel traumatized even if you weren't directly involved. That happens, and it just, a lot of things weigh on how deeply something affects you, but if it affects you, it does, and it's okay. Now, you're not considered a crime victim, but
let's pull that thread there a little bit. I hear you saying that if we can acknowledge and talk more freely about feeling traumatized, that maybe we're on to something in terms of healing communities, whether those are geographic or kinship groups or whatever it is. If you could administer your skill set to an entire community, no matter how you define it, what's some of the messaging or some of the resources you would point them to?
So I'll actually use my team at NCVC, especially because I have a team that is dealing with vicarious trauma from crimes. So they are getting the worst calls of people doing the worst things to each other. And so we've worked very hard on making it a safe space, on encouraging people to listen to themselves and do what they need to do. And as long as they're communicating, they don't even need to tell us why, but hey, I just need a day off. Go, take it. I will say I have openly cried in front of my staff. After the Uvalde shootings, I broke down in tears talking to them because it got to a point where I just don't have solutions to certain things. And being in my position, that hurts because I know people look to me for solutions and I don't have them. Well, I do, but none that I can enact. So it's creating the safe space. So my staff saw me cry, and you know what? So what? They know I'm human. And they know that I'm checking in with myself, and we remind them every so often to check in with themselves. But a lot of my greatest advice is listen to what you need and be okay with that. And then if there's any barrier to you getting to it, just communicate it to us. And my sister is a public school teacher, as is my brother-in-law, as were both of my parents. And sometimes you just have to say to them, I can understand. I don't know how scared you are every day. I am scared for you. I understand the fear that you are feeling. Please know I'm here. I don't have any solutions. I don't have any answers for you, but I'm here to talk about it if you need to vent.
Immediately, my mind is going to the force and all those law enforcement folks who are also experiencing and re-experiencing and traumatized and re-traumatized. And I don't know if Jen, as chief, ever got up in front of her folks and cried. I'm not sure I could ever see a male chief doing that, but I definitely admire your vulnerability, Renee, in just presenting that, modeling that we're all going through something and creating a space where people can take what they need where that's appreciated. Jen, I know this is a whole other world that we are going to address with this podcast, is the self-care and the traumatization and re-traumatization of what it is to be out there. Do you have anything you want to say about that?
No, because I think we really have to go into that realm when we have time to go kind of deep on the impacts of repeated exposure to depravity and trauma and death and people on their worst day. So I think I really want to just try and get a few more tidbits out of Renee, because our time with her is limited.
Okay. Yeah, I would ask the magic wand question, Renee. You have a magic wand, you're going to repair something in the system. This is like, it's done. You wave your magic wand, and this is now part of how victims and survivors receive care. What would you change? What would you make better?
I wish that our government officials would look at victim services with the same importance that they look at as crime prevention, because it really is crime prevention. So we know that, and I hate this phrase, and it's so cliche, and it's just, ugh, but hurt people hurt people. I don't have a better way to say that, but it's true. So when you look at incarceration rates, when you look at juvenile offense rates, 90% or higher have usually been the victims of crime that did not receive services because they weren't accessible, and they never got the chance to deal with the trauma. And I think that if we started to kind of flip the script from being tough on crime to being victim focused, we could actually start to move the justice system forward a little bit more.
You're working with incarcerated people right now, aren't you?
We do work with incarcerated folks. Yep.
Oh, sure. I mean, there are a lot of incarcerated folks who are victims also. There is duality, and sometimes more than duality, of where people are. And there are many, many victims who go on to become perpetrators, or who are co-occurring as both perpetrator and victim. So yes, of course, those victims deserve services also. Renee, in your experience, when you think about terrible crimes, major crimes like the one that we're talking about today, what is the impact on a crime being solved versus an open, cold case for the families? Like, what's your observation of when a case is brought to a final resolution? What's the difference for that family?
Most of them have said there's just a sense of relief. There's closure, there's a sense of relief. There's a sense that, and this is what I love about most of the victims we work with, a lot of the times they end up coming forward and they say, I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to somebody else. I just want to see this person incarcerated so that this does not happen again, so they can't hurt somebody else. So there's that sense of closure for them.
And a sense of obligation to your fellow human to not let this person perpetrate again.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Is it too much of a stretch to say that victimization can bring out the best in people?
I think it can bring out the very best. I think it can connect us. I think sometimes we forget how interconnected we are. And when you are victimized, you remember that. I wish it didn't have to come to that. Likewise, it can sometimes bring out the worst in people, and it can make you very, very angry.
Yep.
But no matter which way it goes, it triggers something. And your life has been interrupted in a way that you will never be able to get back on the course that you were on. And I think that's what I would say to victims. You might not ever feel normal again, but that's normal. That's not anything you're doing wrong. That's not anything that's wrong with you. Your life has been interrupted. You've been shoved off course. The best you could do is get on a new course, but don't expect it to necessarily be the same. And if you're feeling certain ways, that's okay.
Yeah. You know, we talk about, when I was in the sex crimes and child abuse unit, we talked a lot about trying to make victims understand that it's not their fault. And for me, that resonates with me. Like, I got that. But there were so many victims who couldn't forgive themselves. And I wonder if you have any better words for victims than anything I was ever able to share with them.
I think that it's, no matter what you did, this person did this to you because of who they were. And no matter what you did, they were going to do this because they had the opportunity. And that has nothing to do with you.
Right.
the question hits close to home because, I don't know, do we want to get this personal? I was a victim of rape. And I blamed myself for a very long time, and it took a very long time. And sometimes it's just you coming out of it where you say, maybe I did put myself in that situation, but that wasn't an excuse, because no person in their right mind would have seen that as a dangerous situation. And so no matter what you did, what happened to you was still because somebody else made decisions.
Made a choice.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't be sorrier to hear that, but I'm not surprised to hear that somebody with your interest in and depth of knowledge and level of empathy that might be the case. And obviously the statistics bear it out that at least one of the three of us had to have been
Exactly.
a victim. Sadly, that's true. But I think about how hard victims are on themselves. And then I think, again, back to what I talked about before, about how society tends to always be searching for a reason to downplay the savagery and the diabolical nature of the perpetrator, because somehow it must be the victim's fault. And maybe you have a lot more psychology studying under your belt, but how do we shift that narrative?
That one I don't have an answer to, because I think we've tried so many different ways. And I don't know if there's an answer to that. I think that is possibly just innate human nature. I think it goes back to, and this is similar, I've been asked so many times, why do I think true crime has really taken off? And I think that we can't fathom as a society, as normal functioning people, could fathom that somebody could be so depraved that they would do some of the things that they do to others. Since we can't fathom it, we have to find a reason. And there's no good reason. There isn't. Our psyche tells us we have to search for one.
So it's a self-protection. It's a survival mechanism. Well, let me ask you this, Renee. When I think about Prieto, who murdered our friends, Warren and Rachel, I don't think any degree of restorative practice or anything was going to prevent him from the savagery that he was perpetrating all across the country. And I know it's the exception. That's not the everyday crime that we deal with. But is it too far a stretch to say that some people are just pure evil and they could not be corrected any other way than through incarceration?
Oh, I agree with that. No, I think there are some people who are, and nothing happened to them. They had idyllic childhoods. But I think you were right when you said that's the exception, not the rule. And so if we could cull down these other crime rates, we could start to really focus on those people.
Yeah. The outliers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, we see those in every society. And there are prisons in every society for folks like that. So I believe that there are those people who exist, yes.
So if we were to develop a soundbite in this podcast that was Renee's advice to survivors, whether that's a family member or that community, one of the communities we talked about, in the wake of a violent, terrible episode like what happened with Rachel and Warren, other than telling them not to talk to the wrong media people, which is brilliant, how does the everyday Joe access resources? Like, how does the everyday person know how to get the help?
Unfortunately, they have to report it, usually. So let's assume they reported it. Ask, and don't stop asking. Ask the police chief, ask the police officer. When your case gets transferred to a DA, ask the DA if you haven't talked to someone. Keep asking.
To be persistent and advocate for yourself and your needs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And don't let anybody tell you how you should feel. There's no playbook. There's no right or wrong way to feel. Nobody can tell you how you should feel.
That's right.
If you or someone you know is connected either personally or as the result of violent crime to Alfredo Prieto, a convicted rapist and killer who lived in and around San Bernardino, California, Arlington, Virginia, and Jamaica, Queens, New York between the years of 1984 and 1990, we'd like to hear from you. Please email us at info at theheromakerpodcast.com.
You know, I really loved Renee's victim-centric approach. And when you play it out, I mean, it's not just because that's her job. When you play it out, the next couple logical steps, and you acknowledge that so many perpetrators were themselves victims of crime, either as children or prior to becoming perpetrators. If we can provide those services and needs to crime victims at the earliest opportunity, I feel like we're not only breaking the cycle of future perpetration, but we're healing people and restoring them to feeling like productive members of society and valued and loved by their community in a way that we haven't always done so well. But I loved her victim-centric approach. I also really appreciated, because it mirrored my own experience, that there is no one way to react to being a crime victim. Everybody's journey through post-trauma, post-victimization is different. No two journeys look alike. And, you know, I really appreciated that, because that's exactly what I experienced in my career, was that there was no right way to grieve, no wrong way to grieve, no proper timeline. You just had to show up and be present for people no matter where they were in their journey following a traumatic incident.
Absolutely.
One other main point that I think is important if we're going to be trying to give best tips and tricks
Yeah.
is shining a bit of a spotlight on Renee's advice to use your victim advocate.
Yes, yes, yes. There's an amazing victim advocate that has come up in other interviews that was actually on our case, Sally Fayez. And
Yes.
she's a director of victim services in Fairfax, and she's won a bunch of awards. And I don't know how many times I've said this, but I can't wait to have her on here.
Is she coming on?
Oh, yes, Sally, you're coming on.
Okay, Sally. Sally, get in the saddle, girl. But, you know, this is the thing that, like, let's just presume that maybe somebody was a crime victim 30 years ago and they or a family member were a crime victim today. The field and profession of victim advocacy has grown and blossomed and changed so much just in my career that it is so much better prepared and able to meet the needs of today's crime victims. It was really just an emerging profession, so to speak, in the 90s.
So Jen is saying use your victim advocate. And then if you, because of the type of crime, and it's different from state to state, who gets services and who doesn't, if you don't get a victim's advocate or you get a crappy one or whatever, I'm sure everybody's out there trying to do their best. Remember, seek out some alternative opportunities like parallel justice. And then also
The National Center.
the National Center for Victims of Crime is there for you.
Yes, exactly. If a victim's needs are not being met at the local or state level, they can turn to Renee's organization.
And you should anyway. I mean, it seems like they have great advice.
Right on. I mean, they have that 1,000-foot view above all the different rules going on in the different states about what the definition of a victim is and what that allows them to have access to for resources. So I guess I just really want to reinforce that today's victims advocates are not your grandma's victims advocates, and the field and the profession have grown so much just in my career. So really grateful for that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just thank you so much, Renee. It was lovely to be with you. And the conversation was so robust and nuanced, and we got to go in a lot of different directions. And we got to drill down on some specifics of our particular crime that we're researching, but also got to provide a lot of information for our audience. And it was a great conversation.
Yeah, Renee, thanks so much. That was really an outstanding conversation. And I really related to so many parts of it. And they come from a place way back in my career. It's been, more than a decade since I've done direct work with crime victims. And so you really took me back to a time and place in my career where the work I did every day was touching people's lives. And thanks for taking me on a bit of a trip down memory lane, although it was a dark place, but it reminded me how important it is to get it right when we encounter crime victims.
Thanks to audio producer, mixmaster, and sound designer Andy Bill of Submachine Audio. Thanks also to media producer Michael Doherty. And thanks to me, Hero Maker director and producer Andrea Schreeman. Please subscribe to the show where you listen to podcasts and take a moment to rate us. It really helps the podcast grow. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Hero Maker Pod. Want to collaborate or suggest a guest? Please email us at media@theheromakerpodcast.com. The Hero Maker Podcast is a production of Prudent Pictures. Thanks so much for listening.